Hey there, Bixby developers. Today we're doing an updated tutorial on input views for Bixby Studio. And we're going to start by showing you guys what you'll be building through this tutorial. The capsule that we'll be building is a simple survey capsule. And basically it collects some information.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Jonathan. What is your email address? When did you start using Bixby?
2 weeks ago.
When are you planning to build something for Bixby?
From November 18th to November 25th.
Do you like this capsule?
Yes.
What kind of tutorials would you like to see next? Any additional feedback? Here are your incredibly thoughtful and appreciated responses.
And as we can see, this capsule managed to collect all this information from us and finally, of course, just show it back to us. And this video, we'll be building those input views, and that way you'll be able to collect information from the end user. So we're going to start off with a completely fresh capsule, and we're going to do that by clicking Create New Capsule. And it's just going to be playground.survey, whatever you want to name it, but I'm going to name this one Survey Tutorial. And obviously, since this is a completely new capsule, it's not going to be able to do anything. So we're going to have to create all the concepts and actions from scratch. Let's go ahead and start with our first concept, which is going to be the name. And that'll be the first thing that we collect from the user, as well as the first thing that we start with. So name of the user. We're going to need to create the survey structure that will hold all the different responses from the user. And structures, in case you're not familiar with, they're basically like objects in Bixby that can contain many different key value pairings. So the first property that we will be collecting from the user will be the name property, and the type will be the name concept that we created earlier, and this will be required as well as only allowing one. And now we need to create an action that will actually start the survey. And we'll just name this the startsurvey.model.bxb, and the template is that of an action. Just click create, and now this one we're going to want to collect some stuff with it. And we need to collect the name from the user, and of course we can just collect, the name concept that we had from earlier. And this will also be required because it is also required in the survey model. And finally, it will output the survey structure that we created from earlier. And just to get rid of that warning, we can add a type of search. So next we need to create the JavaScript for this. With every action, you generally need some type of JavaScript. It can be a remote endpoint, or in our case, we will be creating it locally here in the project itself. So here we have the start survey JavaScript, and you need to make sure that the parameters that are passed into this JavaScript action match the parameters here in the Bixby model version of the action. So in other words, we're just passing in the name here as one of the parameters. And finally, once we have the name, we'll just pass it straight through as the key value pair name. But now we need to link the JavaScript to the action. In order to do that, we use the endpoints.bxb file, and we can just uncomment this one. So for the first one, you need to put in the action, and the accepted inputs are basically the parameters that are passed through in the JavaScript file. So here we have name as the accepted parameter. And finally, the local endpoint is referring to the JavaScript that will be used, and we'll be using the local startsurvey.js file. So now we need a way to actually start the capsule, and we can do that by adding our very first training. And it'll just be a simple start training, or just like if the user uttered start, then we will just fire off the start survey action. So now if we tell the capsule to start,
I need it to continue.
It will tell us that it needs a name to continue. And in order to properly collect that name from the user, we need to do the next step, which is to create an input view for that name. So just right click this and then select New View. And this will be the name.view.bxb. And we can just delete all that and do input view. So this input view needs to match the concept of name. And we can add a message as well, which will be what Bixby says to the user once it's prompting you for the name. And we will render a form. Now we're going to be using the form element quite a bit throughout this capsule because, you need forms in order to collect stuff from the user. In this case, it will just be a simple text input. So let me explain what all this stuff is. This is the ID of the text input, and you will use this ID a little bit later in this same view, which I will show you in a bit. But the type here is referring to the model that is trying to collect. In this case, it is trying to collect the name.model that we created earlier. The label is basically the little label that shows up on the user screen. It'll say like your name, and then it'll have the text input section for the user to input. And finally, the max length is obviously the character length. But now we need an onSubmit for this form. And the goal will be to give a name. And the value is this viv.core.form element and then name. This name here referring to the ID that we defined earlier. And finally, we can add this submit button, which will allow us to change the text of the submit button. And now we have an entire screen to collect the name from the user. So let's go ahead and take a look at that.
What is your name?
There we go. And here I can just put John.
Here's what I found.
And you can see here that it returned the name John. Great, but next we need to actually be able to collect it through voice as well.
What is your name?
So if I type here, John,
what is your name?
It won't pick it up. And in order to do that, we need an @prompt for training example. Click add, and then here we can add, for example, Jonathan as the utterance. And the goal here will be a name. But here we need an @prompt for as a specialization, and it is @prompt for the concept name that we created. And finally, we need to select this and tell it that this is our name and click done. So now we've compiled that, and it should work for one-word names.
What is your name? Here's what I found.
There we go, and it worked. But what if we actually did 2 different words?
What is your name?
You can notice
What is your name?
that it is not picking it up. Jonathan, last name.
What is your name?
So we do need to add a few more training examples for that. For example, Jonathan, last name. And let's go ahead and fix that typo really quick. So we're going to highlight this whole thing and set it as the name. And the goal of this will be name and @prompt for name. So now we'll pick up 2-word names.
What is your name? Here's what I found.
There we go, Jonathan, last name. And we should add more training examples for name. I'll do one more. My name is Jonathan. Set the goal, @prompt for, and finally tag this as name. And now the user will be able to say, my name is blah.
What is your name?
My name is George.
Here's what I found.
And it will return George as your name. So there you go. Of course, you want to do more training examples for different ways people can say what their name is and things like that. But this is a good starting point for collecting someone's name. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is to add the ability for this to collect an email address. So right click, and we're going to create our email text object. And then we are going to add it to many different places. The first place we're going to add it to is the structure, the survey structure that is returned to the user. Then we need to add it as an input for collection purposes. And then we need to add it as a parameter to be passed into the JavaScript. And finally, we need to add it to the JavaScript, as well as to add it to the return object. So now that we've added it to all those places, the capsule should get stuck at the email.
An email to continue.
And in order to do that, we need to collect the email with a view, an input view. So we're going to create another input view. Just select all this and change it to input view. But this one will also have the toInput start survey action. And what this does is it allows us to access the stuff that's already been passed into the start survey action. And you'll see why we want to do that. And it's because we can make it a little bit more personable. Now the capsule will say, it's a pleasure to meet you, name, the name that you passed in, what is your email address? And similar to the last one, we need to render a form and the elements. And it will also be a text input like the previous one. And now we're just going to set all this stuff for it to be appropriate for an email. And we're going to add this thing called pattern. And what this pattern does is that the text input box will validate whether or not this is an email or not. And finally, we need our onSubmit, with the goal being the email concept and the value being viv.core.form element email. And this email, of course, again, referring to this ID from earlier that we defined in the text input. All right, so now let's go ahead and try it out.
What is your name? It's a pleasure to meet you, Gio. What is your email address?
So this is the input view right here that we just created, and you can see how it's telling me my name. And here you can see that unless the format is that of an email, it won't allow us to continue. But after I added the @ as well as the dot, for example, .com or .co or whatever, then it will allow us to continue.
Here's what I found.
And let's also add a training example for if someone wants to input their email through voice. We can just do, for example, jonathan@jonathan.com. And this will just be the email concept. And just like the name, we can do an add prompt for email. And you'll want to test this a bit to see, what kind of trainings you need to add for voice for email input. But generally speaking, the user will probably use the text input because it's much easier to input emails like that. Okay, so we've kind of learned how to use the text input as well as, all the steps in order to add an input view. And in part 2, we will work on the rest of the inputs for this capsule. And yeah, that's it.